Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth, and we're picking up today where we left off talking about Tibet and specifically Tibetan resistance with our, well, by this friend, good friend, Jamyang Norbu, who is a Tibetan activist and an author, has written a fantastic book on the Tibetan resistance, but generally has dedicated his entire life to this cause. And we're going to pick up sort of at the latter stages, I guess, of the armed resistance in Tibet and then try to bring this up to the present day. Jamyang, welcome.
Oh, good morning, Sam. Now, let me start things off by going some years back. We talked about the, we are all aware of the Cultural Revolution that happened in China. But one of the causes, of course, was the Great Famine of China that started from around 59 and ended in about 62, in which about 50 to 60 million people are supposed to have died. These figures are not, actually there are now books by experts from within China, So there's no way you can disprove it. And this happened at a time of perfect peace within China. This is not wartime or anything. And, no question of, drought, nothing of the sort. It just happened because of the incompetence of the Communist Party led by Mao Zedong, who started the Great Leap Forward. He wanted to catch up with the West in a couple of years. And he did some of the craziest things you can imagine. And I won't go into details about that, but you've heard of backyard smelters, and everyone had to smelt his own iron. Backyard. Then, like agriculture, like you couldn't believe. In order to, this is like an old agricultural society, but when you get mad people on the top, he thought you're supposed to plow really deep, and then plant seeds. And then also and of course, they said that technique called planting seeds like the scales of a dragon. You plant them close, absolutely close, but then you make them grow by putting extra fertilizer everywhere. And of course, initially they grow so close together, they're so dense. They took photographs of people standing on it or lying down on the top of the crops just to show how great. And of course, they choked themselves, the plants pretty soon. And there was famine throughout China. And we won't go into that, but one of the outcome of the famine was that the Communist Party bigwigs on the top, in the Politburo, some of the old-timers, they confronted Mao Zedong on this. And they managed to ease him out of his position as the chairman of the party and everything else. And they got another person, Liu Raji, to become the president. But Mao, of course, resented this, and they should have been more careful because he's an extremely kind of able wheeler dealer, and he started what they call the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. There's nothing cultural about it except the initial sort of pretext, to launch the revolution, which was a play, and not a very good one either. And then essentially what it was a civil war between the top party people, in which they used, let's say, the dedication of the young Chinese people towards their country and their kind of idealism. They misused it, and they, essentially the whole idea was that people had to turn out to rescue the revolution, which was being sabotaged, which was being hijacked by right-wing people who were dragging it towards capitalism and imperialism. And the whole country went into chaos. You had young people were given complete mandate all over China. Mao Zedong officially, and of course then, and by his sidekicks, he had his wife and everything. And you had this group called the Red Guards going all over China, and then also starting locally, within different places. And of course, you had to join. If you didn't show enough enthusiasm for this, you were the one who were going to be pointed out. And these people went everywhere. And, a large group came to Tibet. And then they picked up Tibetan recruits from younger Tibetans. And then, of course, they started the first thing was the destruction of everything cultural in Tibet. Over 7,000 ancient monasteries, historical buildings, millions upon millions of, pages of text, ancient text, some of which, don't exist anywhere else. Texts that had actually been rescued from India during the Muslim invasions, Buddhist,
Right.
priceless texts, and that had been kept, in Tibet, were completely burned. Then all older people who had just managed to survive the uprisings and all before, but they were paraded out in the street, humiliated, beaten, and very often killed. And then after a while, among the Red Guards, there was a faction. A number of factions came out. They started battling each other to show, basically each one was trying to show how much more loyal he was to Chairman Mao's thoughts than the others were. And there was huge fighting initially with with stones and knives and maybe even with, let's say, bombs, crude bombs they made out of gunpowder and gravel and things like this. And gradually, within the administration, this was in China as well as Tibet, the more conservative element, in the administration began to create their own Red Guards to fight people who wanted the. I mean, this is normal in any administration. You'll always have a group that wants the job of the guys who are on the top, But there are ways in order to make that change. But then here, the older groups, they created their own Red Guards. The younger, the people who wanted these jobs started creating their own Red Guard groups. The whole city of Lhasa was in chaos. Then they started using. I mean, before this in China, weapons are completely sort of restricted. You don't even probably see a gun unless you see it,
Right.
with a soldier. But now they started handing it out to your own groups. PLA were giving out groups that were sympathetic to them. Pretty soon, in the city, they were battling it out with automatic weapons. RPG-7 rocket launchers, what have you. It's just chaos. So in this whole chaos that was happening in Lhasa, and of course, then each party began capturing areas. And the Holy of Holies in Tibet is the main temple in Lhasa. And of course, they killed about a few hundred people in there, basically. I won't go into the infighting, and it's not, in any way important. It's just BS of the biggest and most nastiest sort. But what happened was, since this was taking place everywhere else, in this district called Nyemo, which is in central Tibet, very prosperous, beautiful area, one of those little heavenly sort of places, within the more bleaker kind of Tibetan terrain. The Cultural Revolution came. They started, all the older lamas and priests were taken out and beaten, and what have you. And in that area, there was this young nun who was very spiritual nun, very young, and she was affected by all this, as I think anyone would be. And her own personal teacher, I think, was beaten and killed. And she became very upset by this, and she began to have strange dreams and trances. She went to trances, and she became upset. Now, in that area also, two groups had formed. One that was representing, the party kind of, let's say, conservative element, people who were holding power, and younger groups that were very dissatisfied, especially because the Great Famine had happened. And there was a kind of real anger within the people, especially in the people who didn't have any kind of position within the party. So there was initially conflict, but not really armed conflict, but more like finger pointing and shouting and meetings and things. And this young nun began to have dreams and visions, and she had this vision. Tibetans have this great epic, which is very kind of violent, as all good epics should be. It's supposed to be one of the longest epics in the world, epic poems. And there, the hero, the King Gesar, who was the great Tibetan hero, he has a spiritual kind of advisor, called Manini, a woman. Like the Greek goddess Athena. She was great advisor to Ulysses. So she had dreams of this goddess, and then she entered the politics of that area, and she joined the rebel groups, you know, and they were inspired by her because, I mean, there's something clearly not of the world in her. And she
Right.
said we should attack the headquarters. And
Wow.
she took them, and initially they just beat up a lot of the people in headquarters, and they found some weapons. They took those weapons and they started attacking PLA garrisons
Right.
quite successfully, and they actually wiped out most of the PLA garrisons in that district, and they liberated it. And of course, she became famous,
Right.
throughout, not only in the district but beyond it, all the way to Lhasa, the capital, where people were, like hoping she's going to come around with her band of merry men
Right.
to help them out. And then, but she carried on for some time, and like killed a lot of Communist Party
So this
bosses.
really is like a Tibetan Joan of Arc.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what younger Tibetans now, especially feminists in the Tibetan world, they see her in that way. And I think legitimately so. If you look at the question of visions and stuff,
Sure.
you have to be like fair and objective about it. Joan of Arc had visions of angel, Michael, and Saint Catherine,
Absolutely. Same kind of thing.
and from a simple peasant country girl. So
Yes.
who are we to point fingers? I'm not sort of in some ways saying this was absolutely true, but it's beyond our comprehension.
Yep.
And with this girl, also with this nun, but people began to believe it, and she was very successful. She began to go into have visions, and then she had a whole command structure. Her top commanders she called, like they were called heroes. Like the King Kesar had his own like Knights of the Round Table.
Right.
And so she used them. Finally, it got totally out of control. Whole of Western Tibet, Central Tibet, was now, a place where the Chinese administration didn't work at all. And this got to a point where the Chinese military command in Lhasa, even in China, in Chengdu, they were really nervous about it. And finally, they sent, I think it was in the summer of '69, they sent they sent about 3 or 4 regiments, a few hundred trucks, heavily armed in PLA soldiers. And then they battled it out there. These people didn't surrender also. By that time, they'd gotten used to handling weapons. I think they fought for over a couple of weeks. And of course, in the end, it didn't stand a chance against trained, soldiers. And most of them were killed. Many men tried to escape to the mountain, but again, the Chinese also given orders that they should not allow anyone to escape. Everyone had to be killed or captured. So many committed suicide. They jumped in the Nemo River. Finally, they captured her and 30 of her followers, And of course, they took her to Lhasa, to the city. And now, normally, the Chinese try to, anything like that happens, they try to, brush over things, pretend it didn't happen.
Sure.
But this time, they really wanted to make an example. So they had a huge show trial, public, in an arena, not just in the court. And where they first had military parades, they bought out brand new artillery, even anti-aircraft guns. A lot of Tibetans remember that because they couldn't figure out why you needed anti-aircraft guns. Row after row of trucks carrying anti-aircraft guns.
Right. We don't have any planes, guys.
Before even they brought the prisoners in, and finally, and and everyone had to attend the trial in the city. So you at least had 20 or 30,000 people at the show trial, and you had to scream your insults to them. But one young Lama, who was at that time one of the Red Guards in Lhasa city, he remembers clearly. He said people are spitting on this woman, and she was tied, bent nearly backward. But then she stood up. He said she was like one of those heroes in Chinese propaganda kind of poster, like with her head high up and her eyes flashing. And that's how he saw her when he was a kid.
Sure.
And finally, they shot her, and all her people, I think. at the place called Dode, and put her in a rough grave, and no one's allowed to come there. But then I managed to get photographs of all that.
Of her grave, you mean?
Of her execution.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the Chinese had their publicity people take photographs, right up to the execution. And what they did was they set up an exhibition at her district, a museum, with all the photographs of her and what happened to her, people who were killed, in order to give a warning to that area. So later, that museum people have forgotten about. It was rather dusty. This old man sort of looking after it. Not much of a museum.
Yeah.
But then I think it was the Italian photographer told me about it. So I said, I'll pay you to go back to Tibet as a tourist, and I'll find you a tourist guide who will help you there, and who will take care of the old curator, and you go inside and take pictures.
Good for you.
So he got that, and then we had a big exhibition in Dharamsala, in exile.
Excellent.
So this was.
So she's not forgotten.
No, not by a long shot. So, but after this, the whole Cultural Revolution, when all this madness took place, and what came out of it in the end? Nothing. China just, sort of slowed down and came to a dead halt. The administration came to a halt. Education, science, industry, everything came to a halt. Even, what you might say, agriculture. And then you had the second big famine that no one talks about.
Right.
From 68, 69, 70, 71. So, the things are so kind of gargantuan in China, the disasters and the misery that you can't even keep track of it.
Yeah, well, I think your point is dead on when you say that, it is amazing, and I think you've referred to this over the course of multiple episodes. If you ask people about the Holocaust and the Jews, most people are aware of this, as they should be. It's a horrible tragedy. That's not my point. My point is that when you look in communist China, this was true in the Soviet Union, but I think the Chinese do it on an even bigger scale. The number of millions of people who have been killed is just mind-boggling. As you say, it's like you can't get your head around it. You can't even conceive of how many of their own people these communists have been responsible for the deaths of. And yet it's almost like it didn't happen. People just don't even think about it.
And the problem really is also one of the great faults, I think, of liberal intellectuals. I'm a liberal,
Sure.
Absolutely. But liberal intellectuals in the United States particularly, they've always been, and even among, let's say, the right wing in the U.S., there's always been a soft spot for China. Because a lot of these kids, because like when you were a kid and you went to church, you had to put your penny for, to save souls in China. That China was your sort of, it was your patch, like India was to the British Empire. Yeah, China, American missionaries went there to save Chinese souls. And, so people on all different political parts of the political spectrum have some kind of little investment in China. And even academically speaking, the United States, Harvard especially, is one of the leading places where China studied. So there's always, unfortunately, there's a kind of unjustifiable kind of turning your eye away from reality, within this.
Yeah. Of course, I don't know if I was going to say the irony, and I'm not sure irony is the right word. Maybe the tragedy is, if you care about the Chinese people as people, not the Chinese Communist Party, well, then you ought to be, the more you care about them, the more opposed you should be to the Communist Party of China, because who gets victimized every day when they wake up?
Yeah, absolutely.
The average Chinese person lives in that hell all day, every day.
And right now what's happening is we see so many prosperous Chinese out here in the United States.
Right.
And different universities everywhere, and, buying up all the buildings and apartments in New York and Central Park, everywhere, And people, wow, China economy must be doing well, but they don't realize the size of the population.
Sure.
Like just even if you have 100 million people doing well in China, it's a tiny little bit.
Yes.
This is part of and that is the thing. The vast majority of people are still in the villages, still
Yes.
doing, are still dirt poor, doing, crappy sort of jobs, poisoned by the environment,
Yeah.
you know, and
Well, or if they're working at Foxconn, they're sleeping. I mean, they go home to the village once a year, and the rest of the time they
yeah,
sleep in a dormitory in bunk beds, 8, 10 guys to a room, stand on their feet all day.
yeah, that's, whether they made those Apple computers and things,
Of
and
course,
you,
it's where
they
Apple assembles all of its stuff.
remember people committing suicide there,
Yeah, they would
So
throw
I
them,
think
and then so they throw themselves out. I mean, you know the story, and I do, but for listeners who aren't tracking, so at Foxconn, which is this big company that assembles electronic goods, basically, the workers were so despondent they were throwing themselves out of windows to commit suicide. So Foxconn's response, I want to start laughing, and again, not because it's funny, but because it's so horrifying. Their
and
response
so
is to string nets between the buildings, not to look at the working conditions, not to address pay, not to figure out why these people are killing themselves, but to physically make it impossible for them to throw themselves out the window. That's
yeah.
the mindset that produces that is, I mean, just think about that. I don't The only thing that bothers me is I'm losing workers. I don't really care
Yeah,
about the
yeah,
fact that you're
yeah.
despondent. So I'm going to make it impossible for you to commit suicide by stringing a net under your window. This is just,
Yeah, so this sort of situation that like we had all along, especially in the post-cultural revolution era, it was horrifying because believe me, and then China after that, remember they liberalized after Nixon went there and
right,
Kissinger, and so then they allowed, especially Tibetans, also to go out of Tibet to meet relatives to convince the Dalai Lama to come back.
right.
And within that, also, I had two aunts, and one aunt who actually was in a senior position in Lhasa in the local government. So they came, and I went to receive them at the border in Nepal. And here, and my mother's the oldest, and this was her younger sisters, and they looked like hags out of Macbeth. Like the story, the witch. No, right? It was terrifying.
No,
They in that,
I know what you mean because that's
and
how
these were
hard their lives were inside Tibet.
And the thing is, these are people who are privileged, not like the others. Huh? These were special party kind of, but everyone has suffered, even party people. Their teeth were loose. Their hair was like, it turns sort of yellowish and wispy when
Right.
you have malnutrition.
Yep.
And my mother seemed like a young girl compared to them. And then initially, I was a little pissed off with them for being part of the party, but I mean, I can't hold it against them. People have to survive.
They have no
But
choice.
yeah, and then everywhere in Tibet it was horrifying, kind of stories you heard. And but the thing was, even after this in China, like when they had the Tiananmen uprising, and yesterday it was the kind of commemoration of the massacre. But that happened also to a great degree because the Tibetans kept up their sort of defiance of China
Hmm.
in Lhasa. Even when they did the liberalization, they allowed the people a little more economic freedom, not political freedom, some economic freedom. Tibetans for a couple of years they sort of enjoyed that. Then people came out on the streets again. From 87 to 89 to 90, Tibetans battled it out in the streets of Lhasa with the police, with stones and what have you. Chinese police were arresting people, shooting them. So, like sporadically over a period of 3 years, there was constant fighting in the city. And then the Chinese students, I think, down in China also began. Because then one year the Chinese made a bad mistake. They thought finally when they put down the uprising, they imposed martial law.
Mm-hmm.
And then they bought in the tanks, and it was really like Tiananmen. Tanks were coming to the city, martial law, you know, the troops totally outnumbering the population. When they did that, it was silent for a few months. So the Chinese took, like they took all the kind of footages they had. They showed it on television, which they should not have done. They showed it to actually warn people and to show that the Chinese, the PLA and the Chinese, police can manage to control these things.
Yeah.
But what happened was, I heard when it got to Xinjiang, where the Muslims are, they were inspired by it. They thought if these, Tibetans can do it, so can we. And
Right.
and I was told, I don't have 100% proof of this, but by young Chinese, that even in China, when they saw these TV footages of Tibetans throwing rocks at it's the Chinese
Right.
secret police, we can do that also.
Yeah.
Everyone had suffered. It's not only Tibetans in China itself.
Of
So
course.
then we had the Tiananmen uprising, the massacre, and the Tibetans carried on. Till 2008, we had the huge sort of uprising again in Lhasa. They practically burnt the city down, Tibetans. It was like it got, but even without by that time, without the Western press there was
Right.
just one or two tourists who were part of the press.
Mm-hmm.
But then a lot of Tibetans by that time we had managed to send in little cameras and things,
Mm-hmm.
videos, and they managed to send out footages. But then what happened is, after that, the Chinese began a much more systematic way of not just using the police, not just using imposing martial law, but using electronics.
Sure.
Every place in the city and and in the suburbs, there's CCTVs. The first in the world, practically. You now talk of Britain having CCTVs everywhere, but in Tibet you had them much earlier. And they had they were in cages so that people, even if they threw stones, nothing would happen.
Yeah.
You had CCTV everywhere. You had checkpoints everywhere, every alley, and because they have manpower,
Yeah. And now they have technology thanks to
Yeah.
us.
And then you know what they did? You have to show your cell phone. They take out your SIM card.
Mm-hmm.
They download everything on the computer there. They do it very fast.
Mm-hmm.
And you got any picture of the Dalai Lama, you're arrested at once.
Yeah.
And then this sort of thing. So it got the city, and even like suburban areas and major kind of settlements, they completely died it down. People couldn't move. You know, you needed, and then they began. I'll get into that later. But I just wanted to, the Chinese, like, it was not only in the cities where they were doing all this clampdown. They wanted to really change the nature of the Tibetan world. And the the majority of Tibetans are farmers or pastoral people. They're herdsmen,
Mm-hmm.
and with their big ranches and living in large tents, and
Right.
very large herds, and living looks rough, tough, but they're fairly prosperous.
Mm-hmm.
People, like on the average, might own 200 or 300 yaks
Mm-hmm.
and about 1,000 sheep. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so it's okay even by American standards. You can
Sure.
manage some, like.
It's a lot of
But these people,
animals.
yeah, and then so they have a whole culture and a world around this.
Mm-hmm.
So now the problem is all the grasslands where these people are living. Especially in northeast Tibet and eastern Tibet, beautiful grasslands. But the Chinese, they had archaeologists and people going there before. They discovered a lot of metals, rare metals, and then they had Canadian mining companies, Australian mining companies, coming to these areas. But the thing is, they really didn't want to start anything without first getting rid of the population. So they, before even they announced any kind of discovery of minerals or anything, they said the Tibetans have to be modernized. Living a pastoral life is not a good idea. children need schools, people need real jobs, they have to be modernized. This is not a modern way of surviving at all. So all these people were taken off their land. They're given a compensation like 10,000 yuan, which is about two or 3,000 maybe dollars. And they have to take that, and then they have to go to urban settlements, which are like, they remind you really of Stalinist sort of concentration camps,
Yeah, well, that's it,
row
because
after,
that's what they are.
yeah,
It's the same thing.
row after row of these cinder block houses, surrounded by high walls, with with guard towers, but there's no one with machine guns on it, because these are not concentration camps. But it's suspiciously like concentration camps. And then next to cities where Chinese, tourists might come, what they've done is they've tried to disguise it. They put on some, on each houses, they try to put on some Tibetan type decoration on it to jazz it up, like.
Yeah, like that's going to fool everybody.
Yeah, there's hundreds of these. And they even announced this as part of their, like 5-year plan. This, like one point it was like about 100,000 families in the last 3 years that resettled. That would be like about, let's say, the average 3 people per family. Like 300,000 people relocate one area. But it's going on, and there's far more now. Nearly going to a million probably. And that they control it. And once it's there, and one Tibetan guy who came from that area, who relocated to Britain, he managed to get in touch with British television, and and although he was scared, he took a few TV people, ITV, and they did a documentary. And it was pretty horrifying. And he was really scared, but they did it, which is a great thing. And the thing is, and they tried to interview people inside there. And it's like, these people had a life before. And now they're in this place where there's no temple, there's no school. They don't even have the bloody company store, So, and then the men become alcoholics.
Of course.
And then there's younger people just playing, this small mini pool outside in the wind. And it's absolutely sad. And then with alcoholism comes, abuse of women.
Of course. Everything that goes with that. But this, you have touched on this so many times over the course of the episodes we've done, is as horrifying to me as the physical violence that the Chinese have done to the Tibetans, the bombing, the artillery. It is always the sickest thing, and this is true, I think, of all communist states, is what the state does to you mentally, right? They don't just want, they'll kill you if they have to, but what they really want to do is break you down, strip you of everything, your religion, your culture, your identity, and create this new man that is nothing but a lump of clay that can't resist. If you think about the novels like 1984 and Brave New World, this was to me always the sickest part, the most evil part, is how they're going to take the population, and at the end, the population is supposed to not want to resist anymore, because they have destroyed its capacity for resistance. And it's evil. That's the only word I can think of for it. It's horrible.
The thing is, in a lot of these areas, especially when people began to be so demoralized and disheartened with everything, it's not only like I was talking about the Northeast, where there were the great pasture lands. Now they started, because these big companies, Canadian and Australian mining companies, and the shares are sold in the Hong Kong stock market also. These are big operations. Now they move to Western Tibet, where you have the pasture land is not incredible, but you have these amazing lakes, hundreds and hundreds of high altitude lakes over an area that's the size of, Western Europe put together.
Right.
And in these lakes, you have every kind of mineral you can dream of. And in particular these days, like rare minerals. Uh, one in lithium. The Chinese claim that the largest lithium deposit is in this one area of Tibet. And, I don't know whether that's true right now. That's the initial kind of survey they found out. But of course, like in South America, up in the
Sure.
high Andean mountains,
Yes.
and in Afghanistan also they found, it's the
Yes.
same, it's the same sort of terrain where you find lithium.
Yeah.
So in these areas, mining has started extensively. Now the trick also what they've done is the locals don't get jobs because they'll create trouble. So what you have are all the labor is from China. The bosses are Chinese and and Westerners. And you see sometimes, and this is what a French Tibetologist who went there, and she had gone to Mount Kailash to do some kind of study, and she was coming, and she said she saw on the roadside really dirt poor Tibetans lined up on the side of the road to get some kind of small, job from some contractors.
Hmm.
And they're lined up, and the contractor comes in his truck, and he says, not even the main mining job, but just some,
Hmm.
to pick up scrap and she thought to herself, you see these. I mean, you see these things in United States, Mexican laborers in front of, Lowe's or Home Depot or something.
Right.
But okay, as sad as it is, these people have come to the U.S. to look for those jobs.
Yes.
The Tibetan story is that these are the owners of that area.
Yeah, it's our country, it's our land. That lithium belongs to us.
No, and it's not only just in a vague sense, like maybe, like
Right.
broad sense that you can. Tibetans actually have documentation
Sure.
claiming those things. But these days, it's like, especially like when you have big mining companies, they have really big publicity departments and what have you. It's hard to, to fight this because now, you're up against Western interests. So, you never know if I'm giving a talk in a university also. The people who, there's Chinese students who might, come out to say maybe China's not that bad. And I don't mind, like people, it's their country. So they try to defend it.
Hmm.
But it's like then you have, educated people with money, raising their hands and really, and trying to do the down on this whole thing, saying, look, let us look at the bigger picture. The world needs this. Where would you have yourself, the iPhone, if you didn't get lithium? That,
Well,
you know,
that's wonderful. Then a free Tibet could decide whether it wants to mine it or not.
but these people say, look, why
Doesn't
don't
belong to the Chinese.
you all live in the United States? This is a big enough world. Why don't we all think of ourselves in an international way? Why do we need to define ourselves by, countries and boundaries and but it's the most specious of arguments. But believe
Yes.
me, it comes especially when someone who is a trained publicist, you know,
Of course.
and he can sell this stuff to a lot of people. So now let me just go on and say, in Lhasa, I told you like people are stopped, at every checkpoint. Now they have facial recognition software for the
Yep.
CCTVs.
Yes.
And there's this is now all this I'm telling you is it's nothing new. This is just like Human Rights Watch and
Sure.
all these people have just come out with it every year after year. It's like voice recognition, facial recognition technology, and that they're using now they first started it in Tibet, and they're now using it in Xinjiang. Because
Hmm.
all the first crackdowns, all these kind of sophisticated experiments that they carried out, this did it in Tibet under one specific, I forget his name now. He was the kind of party secretary there. He was very successful. So finally, Beijing, like thought so highly of him. he had managed to clamp down on everything in Tibet. And he started the big re-education camps in Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
And Tibet, of course, he managed to disguise it fairly well because, he used the big monasteries. And he had these re-educations in there. Then what they did was, when the problem started, the Chinese figured that Muslim extremism might break out in Xinjiang, because some of them had stabbed Chinese, ethnic Chinese in the streets,
Right.
and I absolutely don't blame the Muslims for doing that.
No.
This is their territory, and the Chinese are coming in force, and they sort of look down on the Muslims.
Of course.
And this sort of thing broke out. Then they took this guy, the party secretary of Tibet, was promoted to take charge of the issue in Xinjiang, and he's been very successful there. So you have, people talk of satellite, areas that they cover. They have these massive concentration camps. It's all happened in Tibet. They learned it all. They perfected their techniques, what have you, and then they brought it to Xinjiang. So this is the situation that you have now. It's like, oh, and also the latest is what we knew. This is 2017 from Human Rights Watch. Chinese authorities are collecting DNA samples now. Every Tibet. So you're going to get to a situation which is like science fiction, the film.
It really is. It is the kind of thing that we used to think was science fiction, except now it's real.
Yeah. No, and a decade or so earlier, a lot of Tibetans managed to escape from Tibet. And there's a number of documentaries and TV, and even like one latest is a kind of a feature film that's been made by a friend of mine, a really good one, and about Tibetans escaping from Tibet. And what the Tibetans do is they try to use the most difficult areas to escape from.
So what is the name of the film?
This film is called, there are a couple of them called Escape from Tibet. This one is called Sweet Requiem.
Sweet Requiem.
About a girl remembering this.
Okay.
So before, as I told you, people tried to use the most difficult crossings so that there wouldn't be border guards there.
Right.
So one was just on the side of the Mount Everest.
Oh my God.
It's like this place called Nangpala. The pass was 19,000 feet above sea level. Always covered in ice and snow, winter, summer, all the time. And of course, it was tragic. People died. When they got across and they got to Nepal, and like we had people there receiving, all of them had frostbite. That's the first thing you had to do was, a lot of them didn't have toes, but by the time they came through, you had to, you had nurses and stuff. You had to get them there and clean their feet. A lot of them were kids trying to find a new life. And thousands of them came over. Red Cross actually helped quite a lot, and put up money to help Tibetans and this and that. But then the Chinese thought, this was getting to be too much of a good thing. So they sent really trained high altitude troops, PLA, to this area. And they started basically, snipers, they positioned in a lot of these places and gunned them down.
Just shoot down people who are so desperate they're crossing a pass at 19,000 feet, freezing to death, but you have to go up in the mountains and shoot them and kill them.
Yeah. There was some documentary made. It came out on a Czech TV by some Czech mountain climbers who were there at the time, climbing one of the lower peaks. And one guy managed to hide out. They had their camp there. They hid him in their toilet when the Chinese troops came to look for people. And they put together and they even got one picture of one person being shot, actually, one sequence. But, that just made a little ripple in, world attention. But then, since then, people have found it more and more difficult, because now what they have is they use drones. they've got really high altitude drones, very sophisticated. There's even like I think it's called GGJ2 unmanned aerial vehicles. It's very sophisticated, expensive, and then they've now got satellite tracking in those areas.
Yeah.
So we haven't had anyone managing the escape in the last few years. So this is like people are trying to leave their country. When they leave Syria or they leave Afghanistan, nobody is stopping them.
No.
Or leave Libya to try to get to Europe. Nobody is stopping them.
Well, this is a giant science fiction, much more advanced version of shooting the guy climbing over the Berlin Wall, right? You're trying to leave East Berlin. No, we can't let you leave. We have to have total control. So you could just as easily let the guy jump over the wall, but no, I'm going to kill you. That's what I'm going to do.
Not even with this is what I've constantly say. No matter how rotten the East Berlin system was, the police, they had one rule. They had to warn you. They had to give you a warning signal before they shot you.
Yes.
In Tibet, nothing doesn't happen. It's just cool. These guys are wearing dark shades and they're looking, like it's just.
Well, as you've pointed out, you're talking about a regime that massacred entire villages, that bulldozes people into the ground, that crucifies people. There are no limits to what these guys do. And now they have all the most sophisticated weapons and technology in the world. And more money than the Soviet Union ever had.
No, and the thing is, we have to bear one thing in mind is, there are a lot of conflict areas in the world, a lot of areas where people are oppressed. But, unlike a lot of these areas, the Tibetan capital in Lhasa does not have a single, and I repeat, single representative of the international media. Not one, not even a stringer. And there's no one from the United Nations or any of its related agencies, UNICEF, UNESCO, whatever, nothing, no WHO, nothing. There's no Red Cross, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Medicines Sans Frontières, nothing, there is no one. Like even in the Gaza Strip, which is pretty hairy, you actually have quite a lot of reporters trying to jostle each other for some story,
Of course. I've spent a lot of time in bad areas, and usually there are NGOs everywhere, reporters everywhere. That's every hotel is filled with them. That's who's in the bar every night. But
no, and in Tibet, actually, people do want to go because it's colorful. There's so much, and even if they're not interested in the Tibetan issue, people just want to go because
the history and the culture. Oh my God!
And the landscape and everything.
Yes.
But if they even suspect that you have some kind of relationship to the press, no, nothing. So what you get really are people who know nothing about Tibet, who really don't care anything about Tibet. Few tourists are allowed there, but mostly it's Chinese tourists now. So this is the kind of situation that you have, and there's a few congressmen that I managed to talk to last year. So 2 Democratic congressmen are working with Marco Rubio, from Florida, and they've got a committee where actually they're thinking in terms of reciprocal kind of. The Chinese want to put up more consulates all over the United States in major cities, because there are a lot of Chinese here. So they want. So the thing that they've wanted to do is to say that they need, representation in Tibet and other places. I said first start off with Lhasa City.
Yeah.
America needs a consulate there.
Yeah.
And then you give them one consulate in an American city that you want. Just trade. And this is we're not making a big political issue.
No.
But this is just
one step at a time.
And they're really working on it. So I thought sometimes there are ways to use the system here to.
Well, Jamyang, look, as we're closing in on sort of the end of this series of interviews, if I'm the average person who maybe my eyes were completely closed to Tibet, but I've listened to these interviews and now my eyes are at least a little open. I'm beginning to understand that there's a horror here and a great injustice. And I want to get involved. I want to help the cause. What do I do? If I'm in, I mean, I'm an American, not of Tibetan ancestry, and I
Hmm.
want to try to start to do something that would help the Tibetan people. How do I do that? Are there organizations? Are there people that folks should be talking to?
Yeah, there are a number of organizations, unfortunately, except for a few, many of them have been compromised.
Okay.
Like we had a great organization in Washington, D.C. called the International Campaign for Tibet. But they've been told if you want American support for Tibet, you can't really keep on, with high decibel kind of publicity for Tibet. So they usually just bring the Dalai Lama across. They try to get him to see the president.
Yeah, well,
They're low key.
that's not going to get it done.
So now what we have, yeah,
Speaking softly won't work.
I have an organization that is called the Tibetan National Congress,
Okay.
where we advocate Tibetan independence from China. We don't believe that there's any way China is going to democratize and we'll find a place for
Of
this.
course not. So, what
And
was
then
the name of
there's
the organization again?
Tibetan National Congress.
Okay, and if I'm the average guy listening to this, how do I find you? Are you on I assume you're on the internet?
Yeah, Facebook, and we have a website and everything.
Okay, so
So,
just TibetanNationalCongress.org or .com?
.com. Yeah.
.com. Okay.
And then there's another organization for younger people, people with more energy, and they have a much larger membership, and they're pretty kind of vocal and doing things.
Hey,
So they're
you
called
can't. You wait a minute. You said Tibet. You said young people with more energy. Now, both of you. That's putting down both you and I at this point in our lives. I refuse to concede they have more energy. I've got to still pretend otherwise.
anyway. So they are sort of they're still, and the thing is, I've really tried to work with them because life is finite,
Yes.
and we need new people coming into
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
and so
Exactly.
you really have to get younger people, even if they don't know much about what had happened. They need to be in a position of responsibility.
So, what
They
was the
need to
name of
be.
the group again? I'm sorry, I interjected
It's called
and
uh,
interrupted you.
the Students for a Free Tibet.
Students for a Free Tibet. Okay, I've talked to some of the guys from that group. Good
Yeah,
people, very
yeah,
good people, very energetic.
and they are very good. Then there was a great organization that was very big in the Tibetan world called the Tibetan Youth Congress, and they've had problems from the Tibetan establishment for having too much to do with me. But but they're coming back. They're really the Tibetan Youth Congress is also kind of now people have, especially after the COVID thing, people have realized there's no way you can deal with China, hope for something nice to happen.
No.
You have to stand up to them and fight them. So
Yes.
I'm really hopeful in the next year that there'll be sort of more change, in the struggle. Now Hong Kong, their slogan is like liberate Hong Kong.
Yeah.
They're not talking about wanting a few more freedoms. They want a liberation.
Yeah.
Taiwan has decided it really wants to go the independence way. There's no kind of now two groups, one wanting independent, one
Right.
wanting more
Exactly.
business in China. So things are changing, and for me the main thing is that people should realize, especially in the Tibetan world, things are so desperate right now in China. The secret police are everywhere. You just cannot breathe. That you cannot even have a demonstration. This because demonstration requires that you talk to another person
Yes.
through cell phone. That they monitor everything. So,
Uh,
so the trick now in the last few years, what it's been for people is you just do it yourself. You take a jug of gasoline,
mm-hmm.
you get a big lighter, and then you go into a fairly populated area. Maybe you have one person, you tell him to take a photograph of you, and you don't even tell him what you're going to do. And then you sit there in the prominent area and pour the gasoline on you, and you light yourself. And
Self-immolation.
so we had, few self-immolations in Vietnam caused the Diem regime to topple. One self-immolation in Tunisia caused, the Arab Spring to happen. In Tibet, it's 165 now. Mostly young people, and that's still going at it. But now the Chinese are getting very nervous about and it's had a big impact, although Chinese don't admit this at all. They've had high-level meetings on this because they know what happened in the Arab world with
Yeah.
the self-immolation. So they've really told the local authorities, do everything you can to clamp down it. And one thing the local authorities actually realize now, you cannot use violence and force on this. How can you? There's nothing you can do,
There's
really.
nothing you can do to stop a guy from
Yeah,
setting himself on fire.
they've tried to arrest his family and stuff, but these people actually didn't even know, and everyone knows that.
Exactly.
So,
Whatever
so,
you do to my family after I'm dead doesn't.
so,
I don't hear about that.
so the good thing that come out of this is local authorities, especially now China. The last few years they're printing money. Basically, they have so much cash. They want all these kind of fancy projects, infrastructure projects. So the government is giving money to local authorities saying, use this. So the local authorities, what they've done is talk to younger groups of people, saying, look, we're not going to clamp down on the language issue now. If you want to publish Tibetan language books, why don't you do it? As long as you don't talk, say, independence, right? Do anything you want. People are getting nervous. So
Yeah,
that
they
has
are.
created, in some ways, a little kind of renaissance.
Well, I think you mentioned Hong Kong. I mean, the fact that the Chinese are clamping down on Hong Kong is obviously not a good thing. But why are they doing it? They're doing it
Yeah.
because they're afraid that Hong Kong is the match that lights the fuse that burns back to the mainland.
Oh,
That's the real
absolutely. Yeah.
that's the real concern. The real concern is this fire can burn back and all of a sudden the ground goes up under our feet. I mean, in my mind, and this is a whole other subject for another day. I mean, when the Chinese decided to go down this road of economic liberalism, it was because they saw what happened in the Soviet Union, that it collapsed
Mm-hmm.
economically,
Oh,
not
yeah.
militarily. So we're going to fix that. But they understand the only reason anybody puts up with them is because the economy has to improve all the time,
All
even if
the time.
it's marginal. As second that they can't deliver that, they're terrified of their own people. They're terrified of their own people saying, I won't put up with this anymore." And a lot of things are happening in the world, as you've said, that suggest that they should be worried. Let me bring this back because we're going to have to wrap up here. But I've
Okay.
referenced multiple times your book on Tibet, and I have been very remiss on the Tibetan resistance. And I've been very remiss because we've never actually given the title of that book.
Mm-hmm.
What is that book?
No, one book I've written actually,
Yes.
uh, it's called Warriors of Tibet.
Okay.
It's a biography actually of one fighter, but it tells you, broadly the story of what happened, the fighting from 56 onwards.
Okay.
That was my earliest kind of book.
All
I
right.
wrote 1978, I think it was published.
Okay.
And it's out of print now, but you can buy secondhand copies on Amazon.
Okay.
So if you want, I'll send one to you. So,
Well,
but then I have a
I will buy one, but I would love to have it signed by you. But what
sure.
else? If I'm interested in looking for other things you've written, what else can you recommend to people?
Mostly I've written, political essays.
Okay.
There's books called Shadow Tibet.
Okay.
One's called Illusion and Reality, and one's called Don't Stop the Revolution. So there's that you can get on my website, and you can order and things.
And
But
what is your website?
it's called Shadow Tibet. You just
Shadowtibet.com.
you just Google Shadow Tibet, and it'll throw you up.
And you'll end up there. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing is, I've just finished a book last year.
Okay.
So my initial publishers, I've had problems with them because they thought this book is way too big, and it is big. It's about 900 odd pages. But I'm finding some other publishers, and this is about a complete encapsulation of what happened in Tibet after the Chinese invaded, but not as history so much as multiple memoirs of myself and all the people I knew, because I was in this business since the beginning,
Right.
even since I was a young man. And then also I joined the resistance. I knew a lot of the leadership. I was in Tibetan politics for a long time. So through the memoirs of all these people that I knew, to discuss the invasion of Tibet, uh, the uprisings in '56, uprisings in '59, and today, the uprisings in Yemen after the post-cultural revolution, uprisings that I talked about, and everything else. But as a literary, exercise, like War and Peace, but not fiction, but non-fiction, but it is done as literature. For me, this is, I think it's important to do it that way, not just as a book of facts that come out in 1 year and then it's after a while just stays in the library shelves. So my earlier book I'd written and realized that I wrote a book of fiction called it's called The Mandala of Sherlock Holmes. It's a pastiche on Sherlock Holmes.
Mm-hmm.
So it was published. It was about Sherlock Holmes' adventures in Tibet and India, and actually taken from the main Sherlock Holmes
Mm-hmm.
stories, or just two lines, and I expand on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a big hit in India, like first published by HarperCollins. So it got the main award in India for English fiction.
This is the Mandala of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, Mandala.
Right.
And it was published in Britain by the original publishers of Sherlock Holmes, John Murray, the oldest kind of,
That's fabulous.
publisher. So it was a big thing. They had the whole kind of, they had members of parliament and all coming to their very old building, and like we had a big ceremony, and there are a lot of Sherlock Holmes fans. But what I realized is that works of literature have life.
Yeah, they do.
This was published in 2000. It was published in 2000. It's running every year. I get royalties on this, 200, 300-page book.
Yeah.
So I realized it has to be. People want to read something as a story. They just don't want to be informed. They want to be drawn into it and experience it. So that's how I've done my book. It's called, my book, the latest one is called Echoes from Forgotten Mountains.
Okay, well, when you and I are off the air, we need to talk about that, because you and I discussed before, and I have been remiss in giving you, the limited help I can give you in finding a publisher. But I promise to do that, and I will.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you very much for taking the time to do all of these episodes with me. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.